pays the tax, as Peter rightly says, that helps us run the civil service.
One complaint that came to me, just to wrap this one up, was that you go to a government department if you find it open, and the staff there are more interested in talking to each other than serving people in the queue.
Well, that may be
Is
true
this ingrained into the
Gibraltar
DNA?
I don't think it's true of every department, and we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of generalizations, because all generalizations are wrong, including this one.
But look, that happens in UK supermarkets and post offices too. Yeah. So I don't accept, look, I accept, and I think most civil servants would accept, that as with every organization, there is much progress that could be made. I do not accept that the civil service in Gibraltar and the attitude of civil servants in Gibraltar is particularly different to the attitude of civil servants and public servants in the UK. So this is not a Gibraltar issue, this is a public sector, private sector issue in all countries, I believe, which does not exonerate us from the need
do you agree with Fabian that more training
Well,
is
the only thing that I don't agree... Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Look, Fabian, there has never been more training available for civil servants. Hundreds of civil servants have done business management courses. The policy of the government is that any civil servant that wants to do personal development, academic, professional of any sort, has a standing open offer from the government to have it funded, because we have said that the government as an employer has the principal interest in their employees getting more and more skills and more training. Those that have not taken up, it's been their choice, and not because the service and the facility has not been... There has never been more training opportunities in the civil service than now.
Time is running against us.
Yes.
I want Keith to wrap it up with a minute to finish this argument.
The anecdote that you told happened to me in a bank recently. So it's something that happens not just in the public sector, it happens in the private sector, and it requires... Look, I don't see this as a ring-fenced issue. This is not a service deficiency issue that only affects the public sector, not the private sector. I think there is, for whatever reason, a need now to conduct training in both the public and private sectors as to the delivery of counter service and face-to-face service to the consumer, not just when you go to pay your tax, but when you go to your bank, when you go to your hotel, when you're the taxi driver and you speak and you're driving someone around Gibraltar. It's about all of that, because otherwise we're not going to deliver an A to Z service in an economy where we rely on tourism.
But when you train people, Frank, you have to allow them to do what you've trained them in. If you ask civil servants to do training in management, and then you don't listen to the ideas that they come back to you with, what's the point of funding the training? If you train them in IT, and then you stick them in a dead-end job, what's the point of having funded the training? You've got to make the best of this human resource.
Point made. Gentlemen, many thanks indeed. We've just gone past the 2-hour mark. It's been a pretty exhausting session down at this end, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and also that you've had food for thought in order to compose some of your own questions from the floor, because the second part of this evening belongs to you, and we'll have people with roving microphones giving you a chance to speak to one, two, or all three of the party leaders. So if we could reconvene in 10 minutes. For the moment, many thanks indeed. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We've started kind of scheduled 45 minutes for this. It's a fairly quick-fire session coming up of questions from the floor. And the idea is that the three leaders will answer as briefly and to the point as they possibly can. And we've got two roving microphones, Gemma and Craig, have radio mics with them, and they'll hand the microphone to the person who catches my eye. The first person who catches my eye is Gemma herself, because she's got a question which relates to the end of last session. Gemma.
Leaders, thank you very much. The one thing that none of you actually committed and none of you actually addressed was a question of the opening hours for business counters. This was overlooked in part of the... It got lost in the question, actually. So I'd be very grateful if you could actually let us know what your stance is on the opening hours for the counters in the business sector.
I'd be happy to do that. I think I'm going first.
Yep.
We are...
Time's up.
The reason, by the way, let me get my own back. The reason, by the way, that none of us answered it is because Frank derailed the debate in the last question.
You don't get to the point.
We can carry on, Punch and Judy. We spoke about this with the GGCA yesterday in our meeting with them, and in the context of their aspirations for a review of many areas and manning reviews and so on. And what I said to them is that we would be committed to sit down with the GGCA on a very broad agenda of improving the public service, and that included the way that service was delivered to people. And that's not just about training in the way that the counter service and the face-to-face interaction with the user and customer of the public service is concerned, but also in the way that different departments operate, and that there are different departments, that not each department can be dealt with on the same basis. There are different departments that interact with the business community or other aspects of Gibraltar in different ways. We need to identify those, and in those, if we need to provide service outside what are the regular hours, then we do need to sit down and speak to them and indeed have an open discussion about that. And I found the GGCA yesterday to be quite receptive to that discussion. Whether positions harden later, if we had a formal negotiation, it may be, but certainly we would be committed to looking at that.
So you're going to look at it, okay? Fabian?
Well, I think that this is an issue that has two strands to it. We've already spoken about e-government and how that would make counters largely irrelevant in the medium to long term. And in terms of physical counters, what we're saying in our manifesto is that we will establish a central government counter office in the centre of town, where you'll be able to interact with the government and collect all the forms you need and submit all the forms that you need. We think that that counter can be open general business hours, namely from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And it's possible to provide to you, the private sector, the service that you want without having to have all of the government departments all around the place, dotted around as they are now, keeping their counters open for that long. It's setting up one office very accessibly in the centre of town and keeping it open for the hours that you need.
Peter, we've got a little
yes,
microphone.
Counters is not just about collecting forms and handing in, handing in things. So you've got to have people there that can help you with the business relating to the issue. But the answer succinctly is yes, we agree that counter opening hours should be extended. In the ill-fated agreement that we negotiated with the 3 trade unions, which was eventually voted down by the membership of one of them, there was a provision for counters to remain open throughout the entirety of the lunch period. In other words, they would stay open morning right through to the end of play in the afternoon without closing for lunch. Thinking, I have to admit, not so much of business, but of ordinary citizens who are themselves workers, who have to get to counters in a very short window during their lunch break, and some of them never actually are able to do it. So the answer is yes, it is possible, it should happen. We have tried successfully with the unions to negotiate such an agreement. It fell down for other reasons. We will revisit it and resuscitate it.
Satisfied, Gemma? Sort of. Okay. Right, Gemma and Craig have the mics. Who's going to ask the first question from the floor? So.
Good evening. World economic crisis is now affecting many streets in Gibraltar. We also are encountering severe competition from Spain and internet. Will the future government assist the traders by taking steps to abolish import duties and also abolish rates on many street businesses?
Will a future government abolish import duties in the light of macroeconomic events?
Well, I don't think if I could take that first, you guys don't mind. I don't think we can abolish import duties altogether. But look, we've abolished import duty, reduced the rate to 0 on most of the goods that are relevant to Main Street trade, and cut it in half to 6% for very many others. And if there are some Main Street retail to foreign business relevant articles, then of course we can look at it. I think the big issue is not, the big issue I don't think is import duties. I think we have to consider doing something about rents. I think the idea that rents only ever go up and that the market value of rents is decided by the last and perhaps single businessman that agreed to pay a silly rent, went bust within 6 months, but then left the rest of Main Street and other streets saddled with that as the so-called market rent. I think we need to tackle that. I think rents going inexorably up and up and up is probably a much bigger threat to business competitiveness than an import duty rate, which has been severely cut already.
What's your solution to the difficulties on Main Street?
I think that...
Sorry, you go.
I think that one of the issues that Ms. Alwani has raised is an important one. It's not the issue of abolishing import duties, but the issue of keeping an eye on import duties and working with Main Street to ensure that their prices are always kept keen. So therefore, there may be seasonal reasons for lowering duties on some items if we want to make Main Street a more attractive place in the summer, if we want to make it more attractive at Christmas. And that's something that needs to be done with the traders who are on the front line and who understand what's happening, in the context of it being passed on to the customer and being used to make Main Street more attractive and keener. And we're very specific in the way that we deal with that issue. It's in our manifesto on page 13, and I invite Mr. Alwani to look at the commitment when our manifesto is published, because I think he'll be very pleased with what he sees.
Keith?
The control of rents in the private sector is way far to the left of and undesirable as far as I'm concerned. I believe that the market will find its own feet, and I don't think that the government should have a place in setting rents in the private sector, or at least not increasing the controls that already exist. One of the things that will be in our manifesto is indeed that we should review the Landlord and Tenant Act, because we think that while it was reviewed and improved, it probably needs to be reviewed again to foster urban regeneration. But on the specific question Mr. Alwani was asking on import duty and rates, I do agree with Peter that I don't think any government would abolish rates or import duty, but I think in the realm of is there a scope in a PDP government for there to be a proper discussion about discounts for early payment, or indeed of reducing import duty for specific goods if representations are made to a government that I lead? Then the answer to that is absolutely yes, because we will be a responsive government to business, and we will try to assist it in particular different ways, like I think has happened in the past, where import duty has been reduced on certain articles.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Anybody with lady in the front row? We'll get the microphone to you in just a jiffy.
Following on the previous question here, where I would agree that rents with market value, and again I think the landlord and tenant ordinance does need to be, is it not one way the government could help? Because the rates are linked to the rates. The rates are linked to the rents. When the rents hike, means you're also paying extra rates. Don't you think maybe a system of zoning of rates, so that prime areas pay a particular amount of rates, and then areas outside that prime areas would then be regulated to possibly pay less? It is not controlling the market forces of the rents, but it would also make it fairer, so that the government is not cashing in on the hikes of the rents because of the market value.
I don't think it's about controlling the market forces of rent. The government doesn't want to interfere. At least the GSD in government would not wish to. Sorry, Freud again. He's been here all night. A GSD government wouldn't wish to interfere in setting market rents. So I haven't sort of gone headlong to the Communist Party, Keith, don't worry.
Glad to hear
what I'm saying is that I think we all need to give more care and attention to when is a market rent really a market rent, and when is it a figure that some business that is doomed to fail and possibly does fail within a few months, to what extent was the fact that there is one ill-advised businessman that's willing to pay silly money, to what extent are estate agents then entitled to say to everybody else, he's agreed to pay that, and therefore it is the market value? We need to define market value. Market value is the rent that is paid by businesses that can then survive. A market value is not a rent that is paid by a business that can't survive, amongst other reasons, because of the rent. So we're only talking concepts here. More care in deciding when a particular figure constitutes a market, and therefore is the market value, and that's fine, but when a certain figure does not deserve to be treated as reflecting the market value, and then should not be applied blindingly from then on as if it were the market value. Your question was specifically in relation to the linkage between
rents and rates.
Look, it's all, nobody likes to pay taxes, and it's very easy at election time for people to ask for cuts in everything that they have to pay, and it's even easier, but not quite so responsible, for candidates to offer to cut everything. But please understand that cutting government revenue means interfering with the stability of public finances, and that what we can't do is invest in all the things that you have been asking and encouraging us to invest, and at the same time cut the sources of revenue. Whether there can be a system of rates that is more tailored by, for example, that there is a different rate of rates depending on the size of the business, whether it's by turnover, so a different rate of rates for small and large business. That is a different question, and I think there would be much more mileage in that.
Have you considered it?
There would be much more mileage in that. Well, it's been proposed, and I think it's a workable idea, because what I don't think you should be encouraging the government to do, any government of Gibraltar, is to help the small businessman by reducing or eliminating rates, as has been suggested by somebody. Does that mean that we should be letting the gaming companies and the banks and the big profitable supermarkets and the profitable insurance companies off rates too? We've got to find a way of targeting help where they need it, and not have a blanket approach whereby to help small businesses, we're letting businesses that can afford and should be paying off the hook as well.
Can I just come into the question, because Peter explained what he meant by the suggestion he was making on rent, but it rather compounded the problem as far as I'm concerned, because I certainly don't favour that the government should have a role to amend legislation, for example, to start now defining what a market rent is in any more significant way than the law already says. I don't think that the government has a role in that. If people are not happy with the comparators that are being used to review their rent, then that's what the court has a traditional and long-standing role to do. And that is certainly, the PDP is not in favour of defining market rent, because what is important is to facilitate the way business is done and the business environment, and that does not include having controls of market conditions, protectionist controls. We're in favour of the opposite. That's why we say in our manifesto that we want to replace the trade licensing regime with a regime that requires licensing, so that people are out in the open and you can see whether they are registered for illegal labour, unregistered business purposes, but you remove at least the controls that would otherwise be on the setup of businesses. On the rates idea, Marilu, I thought that your suggestion actually is very interesting, and it does have mileage, and I think Gibraltar is relatively easily could be zoned, and I think that is something that certainly, if the business sector were to agree to put that forward as a formal proposal, I think that is something that we in government would certainly look at with a keen eye.
If I may now, Marilu, as usual, an excellent contribution with an excellent potential idea. I think that there is mileage, of course, in looking at the zoning that is there already and understand whether it is possible to look into some of those zones and understand whether in some parts of a particular zone we should be sub-zoning. But look, Peter's reaction today in relation to the rents issue is really quite in character, given the suggestion that perhaps this government might be investing itself in office developments in Gibraltar and becoming a player in the market for offices. I have to tell you, I don't think that our government should be involved either in owning offices and becoming a player in the office rental market, although all of us want there to be offices for the new business that come to Gibraltar, or being involved in setting market rents. Of course, if we hadn't had the government putting a hospital in an office building, it might be easier to find office space in Gibraltar today. I think that there is mileage in your idea. Gibraltar is already zoned for rates purposes largely. It's about looking at the zones that there are and perhaps sub-zoning. The fact that Peter said that it may not be such an interesting idea suggests that if he does win the election, he may announce something about it in his budget. He tends to do that. He says he doesn't like the idea,
okay,
and then he goes for it.
We'll leave it there. Whoops.
No, but Marilu, can I just say, I think effectively Gibraltar is zoned for rates purposes because they are linked to rents, and the rents increase and decrease depending on the zone in which you are. Ergo, the rate system is zoned by rates as well. So we've got to find some other way of benefiting small. If you're a small business in Engineer Lane, your market value for rent is less than on Main Street, and therefore your rates are less than on Main Street. That is zoning of the rates system through the rent system, which reflects the zone in which your business is located. So that wouldn't be effective at delivering further help to the small businesses. That, I think, is better done by taking the size of the business, perhaps the nature of the business, the sector of the business, things that are not geographical, but rather which relate to the characteristics of particular different types of business.
I think it's also an opportunity to try and encourage people to establish themselves in parts of Gibraltar that are presently abandoned. For example, there are parts of town beyond Main Street, upwards, where we could encourage people to set up offices.
How would you do that? With tax breaks? Or?
With tax breaks and with incentives, with rates incentives. I think that's an issue that we need to look at rates zoning, and if this is the point you're making, I think it's a good one, and perhaps sub-zone, so that there are areas where we may even give better advantages if you bring a business there. And look, if the business is a relatively large business, all small businesses in Gibraltar tend to be small businesses by the definition of what small businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises are, but there are larger ones and smaller ones. If it's a large one, it can regenerate a whole area if we give them the right rates incentive.
I think it has to be part of a holistic strategy that is not just about rates. It's what I was talking about earlier, and this is why in our manifesto we talk about tax concessions to business, and we talk about soft loans because it's part of the